introduced by an old friend. I'm reminded of the story of a funeral in which the widow was sitting in the front row, and the clergyman went on and on with his eulogy, and as he went on and on, the widow got more and more restless, and finally she tapped her oldest son and said, "Will you go up and look and see whether it's your daddy in the coffin?" I've put this up as a indication of a continuing challenge for the United States that was laid out by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America in 1840, disregard the 1847 date. The heart of it is, a democracy can only with great difficulty regulate the details of an important understanding, persevere in a fixed design, and work out its execution in spite of serious obstacles. It cannot combine its measures with secrecy or await its consequences with patience. That may have a certain ring of truth at this time, particularly with regard to measures of secrecy. I saw the other day that the New York Times was indignant that some secret had been leaked from the White House. The New York Times apparently feeling that it alone has the right to leak the nation's secrets. But the problem that has become a serious problem of increasing leakage of things that should not be leaked. There are many things that are classified that shouldn't be classified, but there are things that should not be leaked. And consequences with patience. Sometime in the early 1990s, I testified before the Armed Services Committee, and I said, this has been a problem for the United States over the years of having a policy that is reasonably stable. And I cited de Tocqueville's challenge, as I put it, and I said, but de Tocqueville was wrong. What the Cold War history has proved, this was just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is that the United States did indeed persevere in its objectives and awaited the outcome with great patience. For 40 years, the United States stood the watch on the Elbe, for those of you who are familiar with the phrase, the watch on the Rhine. For 40 years, we were stable in support of the European democracies. A question that will cross your minds is whether that same kind of stability can be demonstrated as we deal with current challenges to the United States, which are much more amorphous and less obvious to the public, which rallied around the country in dealing with the Soviet threat. Fortunately, from one standpoint, the Soviets were rather obvious in their tactics, and once they had seized Eastern Europe in 1947 and 48, the American public never changed its view that it was our duty to oppose Soviet expansionism. So there is that period in which we managed to rise to the challenge that de Tocqueville demonstrated. In the middle of the last century, Henry Luce, publisher of Time and Life, referred to the 20th century as the American century. And Indeed, he was starting about 1940, so by that time, much of the century had disappeared. And for the rest of the century, it was the American century, primarily because we came through the World War II unscathed. At the close of World War II, the United States had about 55% of the world's manufacturing capacity and about 50% of the world's income. Other countries were scrambling for dollars, which we were rather generous in distributing in order to help them through the post-war period. And then the Cold War started. The nations of Europe in particular, but other nations as well, felt that they needed the protection of the United States. And as a consequence, they rallied around us. And the United States was indeed the dominant power in that period. Its dominance being in part a creation of the reaction to the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States became almost alone in terms of world power. It was what Charles Krauthammer referred to as America's unipolar moment, in that there was no challenger out there like the Soviet Union. There are today those who think that China is rising as a potential challenger, but from the period 1991 until after the fall of Baghdad in 2003, there was no question of US dominance in the world. The question that I want to put before you tonight is whether that dominance can continue. Here is a quotation from the National Intelligence Council, which works for the Director of National Intelligence. And these quotations are from a volume that's produced every 5 years called Global Trends, and this one is for the year 2025. As you can see, although the United States is likely to remain the world's most powerful actor, the United States' relative strength, even in the military realm, we'll come back to that, will decline, and US leverage will become more constrained. The United States will remain the single most powerful country, but will be less dominant. Shrinking economic and military capabilities may force the United States into a difficult set of trade-offs between domestic versus foreign policy priorities. And we shall return later to that subject. The point to bear in mind is that this is not intended to be a declinist view of the world. The United States will still be the world's leading power, but our period of dominance will be coming to an end. This is not by those who condemn the United States. This is by the National Intelligence Council. And why would it be that this period of dominance would be coming to an end? There are a number of reasons. The first is the rise of Asia. China, India are the fastest growing nations in the world. Japan is still one of the world's leading powers, and power has been moving from Western Europe to the Pacific increasingly over the course of the last several decades. If you want to use a particular date to indicate that takeoff, it was when Deng Xiaoping introduced his reforms in China just in 1978. Since that time, we have seen a spectacular rise in Chinese strength, such that by the year 2030, we can expect to see China overtake the United States in terms of gross domestic product, not in terms of per capita income. Chinese people will be quite constrained in what they have, but it will be a degree of economic strength that is slowly spilling into military capabilities. Meanwhile, as Asia rises, Europe is in decline, relatively speaking, and some might say absolutely in decline as well. Europe has a particular problem in that the Muslim populations to the south and to the east are steadily growing, burgeoning, one might say, while Europe's own demographic projections are distressing to see the least. So Europe has lost much of its appetite, which it once exhibited worldwide, for power politics. And Europe tends to believe these days that military power should not be used. And if it is used at all, it should be only through the legitimation by international agencies. The upshot is that since the European allies are our principal allies, any relative decline in Europe compared to those in the Western Pacific is going to reduce America's role in the world, relatively speaking. I want also now to turn to the question of the budget. Joe mentioned that I was once the deputy director at the Bureau of the Budget. We used to say at the Bureau, if you want to know what a nation's policies are, don't listen to the rhetoric. Look at the budget, and that will tell you what the policies really are, as opposed to what politicians would like to dramatize. So what are the realities today that we face with regard to the budget? According to the Congressional Budget Office, the entitlements programs of the United States, ones that, like Social Security and Medicare that support me and others, and Medicaid, which are now 9% of the gross domestic product, will have risen by the year 2025, the same year as the numbers in the projection by the National Intelligence Council, to over 20% of the gross domestic product. The American taxpayers have never been prepared to provide more than 20% of the GDP to the federal government in the form of taxes. And that suggests that all of the revenue of the federal government will be going to these entitlements programs unless they are changed. And if you read the press, there's great resistance to change. During the recent discussions of medical care reform, the Republicans, who have in the past said, let us see if we can cut some of the expenditures involved in Social Security program, said, don't you dare touch Social Security, that senior citizens will rally around us. And it underscores the difficulty of getting change, something that the President of the United States has incidentally learned, that change is more easy to discuss in a political campaign than it is actually something that you can achieve when you're in office. That it is the resistance to change is immense, and particularly in budget matters. So what we can look forward to is tremendous pressure on the military budget. Throw in $600 or $700 billion a year in interest payments on the federal debt, in addition to the amount that we are projected to be spending on entitlements program, and there doesn't seem to be much left for the defense budget. As a consequence, there will be continued pressure to reduce defense expenditures. Now, I am not saying these things because I find them particularly attractive, but we must take a look at the world as it will be, not as what it has been. We have had this long period of dominance, but that is going to come to an end. It's not all that bad. We will remain the leading world power in the future. Others will have to consult us, but it will require a greater degree of national cohesion and national stamina in dealing with something like what the Pentagon calls the long war against terrorism. This is a much more subtle thing, harder to grasp than the threat that the Soviet Union represented or that Nazi Germany represented decades earlier. And you can see it in the resentment, expressed resentment by the public of the casualties in the Iraq War, and now more than 50% of the public does not believe that we should be engaged in Afghanistan. Both a collapse in Afghanistan means a catastrophe for American foreign policy. If we are obliged to withdraw, even if we say that we will start reducing our forces in 2011, other nations begin to make their calculations of the changes that they must make in their policy. Most specifically, think of yourself as a Pakistani or as an Afghan when you are told that Allied forces will be withdrawn starting in 2011. There are very few Pakistanis who believe that the United States will be around in 5 years' time, which is what the US military think is the essential minimum for us to begin to grapple with the problems in that region. If we fail in that region, it will be catastrophic for the US foreign position. But at the moment, there is little reason to be optimistic, given the fact that the American public seems to have been substantially exhausted psychologically, both by the Iraq War and by the Afghan War. And as a consequence, we see great difficulty in sustaining the resolve, the stamina, the cohesion that is necessary for a democracy to be effective. Democracies have worked best for relatively brief periods of time, get into World War II, win the war, demobilize the forces, come back home. It was with great difficulty that we moved divisions to Europe after the invasion of Korea, simply because of the reluctance of the public to get involved once again. We like to move decisively and then end it. The problem with what was called the Long War is that it is not easy to do so. Let me conclude, though, by observing that even though the projections are that our long period of dominance must necessarily come to an end, it's not all that bad, being the leading power in the world, which we will continue to be for the foreseeable future. I think that the future looks generally bright. in terms of avoiding major conflict. Neither Russia nor China, which are the best armed countries in the world, now have any temptation to strike at the United States directly. The threat from China, which is probably more significant today than the threat from Russia, is more of a political, economic nature, in that the world post-2008, with the collapse of the financial system, which had to be buttressed up by the Federal Reserve just a year ago, that the collapse of that system has given great credence to the Chinese model of authoritarian, state-controlled economy. And so the proclivity that existed before then of much of the world to be drawn to the American model has come, if not to an end, it has been interrupted. And countries in Africa, Latin America, are tending to turn more toward the Chinese model. That is more the threat from China than is the military threat, even though we must hedge against the possibility of a serious clash between ourselves and China. The United States has provided protection for other countries. One of the forms of protection has come from the nuclear deterrent that the United States has maintained for many years. It is, as Joe indicated, we have recently had a number of task forces in the Department of Defense and the Commission on Strategic Forces authorized by the Congress, which have come to the conclusion that for the foreseeable future, that the United States must maintain its nuclear deterrent, and that talk that you may have heard about a vision of the future without nuclear weapons would require an adjustment of the world political situation, which is not foreseeable at the present time. The present status of international politics does not permit the elimination of nuclear weapons. So we are in this position in which we are holding the nuclear umbrella over some 30 nations. Most of them are allies in Europe, and we will have to continue to do so if we want to avoid giving those countries an incentive to acquire nuclear weapons on their own. As the Commission indicated, we are near a tipping point in which the non-proliferation policies that the United States has endorsed since the end of World War II are in danger of coming unraveled. One can see that in the nuclear ambitions of Iran and the nuclear achievements, such as they are, of North Korea. A continued unraveling of the non-proliferation regime would make this world a more unstable place, though I reiterate that nobody is likely to launch a nuclear exchange with the United States as long as we have the deterrent. That does not mean that a terrorist group getting its hands on a nuclear weapon could not inflict substantial damage on an American city, and that is part of the long war that we face as the leading world power. Thank you very much.